Welcome, everyone. There's probably a mix of Buddhists, non-Buddhists, and free thinkers, and all kinds of people. So we will try to keep the discussion palatable to all, or at least comprehensible to all. So do you want to say, give me a little bit of your impression of my book, Elizabeth?
Well, I would like to, I'm not going to do plot spoilers. I'll leave that up to Barbara. But basically, I was given this book to read in a Gallic form because I had written about another bride. And I thought, well, you should be interested in reading about Bride of the Buddha, and I was. And I was especially intrigued because I hadn't had a very favorable impression of the Buddha. I had my own prejudices. I try to be open-minded. I'm an interfaith minister. I'm supposed to be. But I think Barbara's going to talk about what a lot of us know as the myth of the Buddha and how he became the Buddha. And a lot of us know, a lot of people are very turned off by an aspect of that myth, which this book delves into very deeply, like, excuse me, you just had a newborn child and you're leaving? So I was like, okay, I want to hear this story. And what was very satisfying to me was that the bride, Yasadara, was someone that I could completely identify with, and she shared all my feelings, and no short shrift was given to all the range of emotion that you might have in that position. So she was so human and so feisty and so brave and so honest that she completely won me over and drew me in. And by the end of the book, I was really very surprised to see that I had developed a new respect, comprehension, and even affection for the Buddha himself, for Buddhism. And somebody said, oh, I'm here, Barbara, because you calmed me down. Actually, that book really, I've noticed it reading again, it did calm me down. It was very exciting and full of passion, but it also really soothed me. I don't think I've said that to you before, Barbara. Anyway, I loved reading it. I've read it twice now. There are many dimensions to it. It's imaginative. It's also very well researched. And I think that might be, I would love to come back and say more things about it, and I will. But I think I want to ask Barbara maybe a little bit about two things. I mean, one, she was already welcoming different readers, the non-Buddhists, the Buddhists, the seekers, the skeptics, the whoever. I want to hear a little bit about why they should read this book, because they should. And also, I want to hear from you, Barbara, what made this book so compelling for you to write. Over to you, Barbara.
Well, that's a lot of questions. Why they should read this book? I think it depends on who you are, but I think that for me, the one reason is that it gives women a voice. It puts women in the center of sort of the human endeavor of where we're going and what's all about, and we get to ask the big questions too. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book from the point of view of Buddha's wife. Not only the fact that she was dumped, and I wanted to understand why that happened and why that had to happen. And so just to sort of set up the parameters, the basic myth of the Buddha that everyone kind of believes in or accepts, I don't know if believe in is the right word, is that the Buddha was a prince in a palace. He had this wonderful life. His father, when the Buddha was a baby, was told that his son would either become a world-turning monarch or a great holy man. And, holy man had told him this. And his father thought, no, I don't want a holy man. I want him to be a king. So I'm going to give him the best worldly life possible. I mean, he'd pull out the stops, palaces for every season, wine, women, and song, and then finally marriage to a beautiful, wonderful princess. And most of all, no symptoms of death, old age, or disease anywhere in the kingdom. Of course, a lot of this is what it is. It's silly myth in a way. But the idea that he's living this wonderful worldly life and yet it's not enough is important. And so when it becomes not enough in the myth, when the Buddha supposedly discovers that there is death, he comes upon an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and then a holy man. And he realizes, first of all, that his life has no meaning anymore, and he's just totally dismayed by this knowledge of death all of a sudden, this existential problem at age 29. And then the holy man suggests, just the sight of him, this is how to solve the problem. Leave home, go out on the road, and discover what you need to discover to solve this existential, horrible problem. But that's, now the truth of the Buddha is that he was never a prince. He was the son of a clan leader, probably. Palaces, lived probably in a nice wooden dwelling that was palatial compared to other dwellings around him, but he was well off. But the rest of the myth is just to prove this wonderful worldly life. My question being, why did he have to leave this wonderful wife? Why did he have to have this wife? Why couldn't he just have wine, women, and song? Then he leaves, and then women don't have to resent him. But I think that the myth has power, and in a way, this power has, I think, more power to Westerners, precisely because he has this mature, loving relationship. A woman he truly loves, he's not happy to leave her, and that pops up in the texts. And it's very, very wrenching for him to go. But the myth is saying, no matter what your life is, no matter how great it is, how many trophies you've had or whatever, life will entail suffering, and it ends in death, and what are you going to do about it? So that's I thought the power of the myth, but that still leaves the problem of the dumped woman and what she, and that still made me uncomfortable. So I wanted to tell her story. The other thing is, like, maybe go into this later, is that for me, the importance of the book beyond that myth is it portrays, I think, the polarities in Buddhism and the polarities, I think, in all religions, which is, on the one hand, to solve these existential problems, we have to, in one way or another, transcend the world and the individuals in it. And on the other hand, we need to love the world and the individuals in it, or we feel love for the world. So how do we deal with that duality? And how do we make that come together? And I don't have any simple formula. I don't come down on one side or the other. I mean, the only formula I have is a little Vedantic quote. And do I have it with me? No, I don't have it here. Anyway, it's on the order of, love tells me I have everything. Wisdom tells me I have nothing. My life is a river that flows between the two. And I think that begins to get at this polarity. So that was one of the things I wanted to explore in the book. The basic plot, I will deliver the spoiler because it's in so many of the reviews and on the cover of the book and everything, is that eventually the Buddha's wife comes back to the Sangha in disguise as a male, as a male monk, because the Buddha does not admit women to his Sangha. And so she becomes the historical monk, Ananda, who is the monk who persuades the Buddha to admit women. And there are some textual reasons I did this. So there's some reasons in the scripture which gave me the idea to pursue this plot line. But so that's so as Ananda, and the historical Ananda seemed to embody those qualities of kindness and love. In fact, the Buddha even says at one point, the Buddha, meaning the Buddhas come in every age, and every age has its own Buddha, but they're all basically the same, and they all have the same kind of attendant. And he says, every Buddha has an attendant like you, and you embody kindness. And so that's what Ananda is. But Ananda has a lot of difficulties becoming enlightened, as comes out in the book. So I was really interested in portraying this polarity because I think it's really important in these times in particular for people to somehow practice both sides of this question, that we have to, because all religions, no matter, I mean, every religion I can think of has to do with overcoming the confines of the self-centered self. But how do we overcome it? How do we transcend ourselves? Well, one way is through love, and one way is through knowing the way things really are, which is what Buddhism specializes in. It's training the mind, really seeing that these selves that we love are illusions, they're concepts, they're not who we really are, and who we really are really cannot be defined. The self is a mystery, and we have to live with these uncertainties, which is difficult. And on the other side, one of the ways of releasing oneself from the self is through love. So but both sides have their problems. So you become this wonderful, well-trained mind, and you know you've had these experiences of how things really are, and they're all impermanent, and you could end up feeling pretty good about yourself, and becoming conceited and really not making that final step, or thinking you're enlightened and you're not. And on the other side, you can become this wonderful, loving person and become very enamored of yourself as a wonderful, loving person and become self-righteous. And so I think these dangers need correctives. And then every religion sort of specializes in some aspect or another of where to go with these polarities. And I think that's why I'm very interested in interfaith work and the relationship between Buddhism and Christianity in particular. Phew. All right, so
Barbara, did you want to read the prologue, or do you want to go in telling us that Christianity and Buddhism leads us a little bit to your own background? What would you like to do now?
Let's start with reading the prologue, just to sort of, the conceptual stuff, sort of calm down the conceptual stuff.
And the flavor of your beautiful prose, too.
As a way to sort of setting up the novel.
Yeah.
And it starts as when the Buddha is leaving. I won't leave without your blessing. Siddhartha whispered so softly, I wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. He stood in the carved rosewood doorway of our bedchamber, and in the deepening silence of my refusal, I pulled Rahula closer, praying that our 2-day-old son would feel only the beating of my heart and not the bitterness that filled it. You don't need my blessing. Just go, find your Dharma. My young husband, who would one day be called the Buddha, didn't move. He stood in the darkness, across the room from our wedding bed, and I lay on my side with my back to him, staring out the window at a moon waning to a diamond white crescent. A single star, sharp as betrayal, was poised beside it. It was just before dawn. Rahula stirred against my collarbone, a small shifting warmth under the cool silk coverlet. My husband had named him Rahula, the common word for bond, but it also meant fetter. Yasi, he said, if you ask me to stay, I will. I looked at him, still standing in the doorway, but he was only a silhouette, his clear eyes and the tender curve of his lips already fading in my memory. Perhaps if I'd seen his face and it had revealed it changed, I would have begged him to stay. But in recent months, his look of sadness and revulsion at the sight of my mortal flesh and all the suffering it implied had lodged in my soul. And now I could think of nothing but that look. I won't change your plans, I said. You are right to cast off your illusions. I only wish you'd done it before we married. I gazed at the rising crescent moon, soon to be effaced by morning sunlight. Already there was a green smear in the east. My husband spoke one last time. I promise if I find the truth, I'll bring it home to you and Mahula. I doubted his words. A minute went by, then another. Finally, the breeze shifted, and the crickets resumed their refrain. Siddhartha had left as I knew he would. He was taking the journey I'd once intended for myself. Supposedly the moon was full the night he left. Supposedly I slept through it all. My version of these events will not be the one told to future generations. I was all but banished from that story. It's the price I had to pay for the life I chose.
Mm. That's a beautiful taste of your writing, which is gorgeous. And I think that I also, one thing that came to my mind when you were talking about the myth of, how he didn't see suffering and then he went and saw the old man. I thought that you handled that very well, incorporating that myth into their story, and that it's not the old man that he sees in that way. It's actually his beloved that he sees in that way. And I thought that was really beautifully done. And the other thing that I really love about this book that I want to say is that it's not a book about the Buddha. It is. He's a really important character, but it's about this woman. And she is a seeker from the get-go. There was the phrase that I was trying to remember the other day that you used, Barbara, is she wants to go forth. That was the phrase you use over and over again about people who want to go out and seek. And there were, I guess, some women who did, and there were all kinds of people who did. But I love that this is her story and her journey.
Well, I know that in your novel, you have the Mary Magdalene story in the same way, very much her story and her journey. And I think it's important to have that. Again, it's sort of putting women, in the center of the journey, rather than simply as some adjunct. So
yes, and or simply as witnesses. I think Yassi and Maeve would have gotten along famously if they lived in the same century. They live in fiction. So yeah, there's so many dimensions to this book. But if you want to, only if you want to, tell us a little bit about your story. Your story. You told me some stories about your parents and how you ended up being a Buddhist practitioner. Well, I started in Christianity.
Right, yes, we could say I grew up in a Christian tradition. I mean, it's more like the religious wars. My father was a Catholic who didn't believe in God, but felt Catholicism was a one true church. And my mother felt that Catholics were worshipers of withered limbs and terrible relics, and they brainwashed their children. So my parents would really fight about this a lot. I don't think I ever heard the word Catholic coming out of my mother's mouth without damned Catholic in front of it. And I never heard the word British coming out of my father's mouth without dirty British coming in front of it. So I grew up a little on the skeptical side. Although for a while, God was a given, and I was interested in my friends' religions, Methodists, and, but I grew up in a Protestant, Catholic, sort of suburb of Milwaukee, the most segregated city in the North, I think. But I gradually became pretty agnostic myself. And then I had some powerful experiences that sort of set me, this was like early 20s, on a less agnostic path. And I was married at the time, and the man I was married to, every single suggestion he had when you had a problem, go to grad school. So I thought, okay, I'll go to grad school. So I ended up in graduate school in religion and literature, and studied a lot of philosophy, actually, and some Christianity, and not Buddhism formally at all. And then, the 70s came along with all the wacky gurus, and part of me thought, well, I really need to humble myself to a guru. But the gurus were so wacky. And one of them ended up committing suicide with his dog's collar around his neck. And these were gurus, lots of times, who tended to sort of mistake their ego for God. And so I was in and out of, reading these texts and, trying to just sort of thrashing about. But by the late 80s, I was getting more and more serious about Buddhism. And so I started doing a lot of residential retreats, silent retreats. And that's where I really, and by the early aughts, I was doing 2 or 3 a year of them. And that's where I really got into these looking at one's mind, which goes beyond just sort of being mindful, but really getting the concentration and watching the mind do what it does. And that's sort of that's part of my little hobby horse now, because I think right now, especially, we need to know that our minds do certain things. When we confront the pleasant, craving will almost automatically follow it. And what craving continues to, as the cycle continues, craving turns into this kind of proliferation of thoughts and ideas. And suddenly that pair of shoes is necessary for my happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's necessary for my happiness, well, there's a bunch of really creepy people who are out against me, and they won't let me have these shoes. And suddenly you have oppositions and enemies. And I think with these conspiracy theories, what happens is you have these initial experiences of self-doubt, fear, uncertainty, lack of control, and then the mind starts producing these illusions. And it happens with everyone. And it happens with me 2 or 3 times a day at least.
Mm.
Hopefully, before I start yelling at Theo, that's my former husband's name, and I swear to you, I have not said that name to him ever till now. So there's the weird mind doing its thing. But before I start yelling at my husband, I like to have a pause between anger and violence. And learning how to cultivate that pause is so important. And that was articulated to me for the first time when some prisoners who had been in prison for 25 to 35 years for homicide and had been released and were practicing meditation and had practiced it in prison and had learned. They said, this is what we learned to do. Cultivate the pause between craving and using, and the pause between anger and violence.
Mm.
And that's so important for us all to be able to do. And so that's that idea of knowing the mind, that was what really came to me when I was practicing Buddhism. I mean, when I started doing the retreats especially. But meditation and being that mindful, yeah.
Your stories of the gurus that you encountered really makes me even more appreciate your depiction of the Buddha and maybe who he really was. I'm not a Buddhist, but he seemed to be really, the way you depict him, he really didn't mistake himself for God. He really didn't get mixed up about his ego. He really had all those followers, but he was so balanced and so grounded, and he had humor. And I thought the way you depicted him made him very human, but very grounded and human, like not on any kind of a trip. And I also really liked their relationship as it evolved. And you said something about that Ananda had the reputation of being the one that would ask questions that no one else would.
Right.
So their relationship was such a delight to me, because even though he was her teacher and he was the Buddha, the enlightened one, she didn't pull her punches, and she was very honest with him, and he was very honest with her, and he was so not guru-like in the way you depicted him, and I really appreciate that about him. That's what made me really like him.
Well, I tried to quote him a lot from the pictures, but full disclosure, he's a much more archetypal figure, I think, in the suttas a lot. I did, but what I did was what I felt of the Buddha, and he does say things that, like, for instance, when he's asked about when he dies, which rules should we keep? He has the Vinaya is one of the collections of discourses, and the Vinaya is the part that gives the rules for the monks and for the nuns to keep, and they accrued during the Buddha's lifetime. Every time some situation came up that was screwed up, but he had to invent a rule, like no drinking in the dorms, that kind of thing. He said, well, the minor rules you can abandon. He had that dimension of casualness. But then the patriarch, Kassapa, said, nope. He asked Ananda, what rules should we keep? Didn't the Buddha tell you them all? He said, no, he just said, abandon the minor one. You should have asked him. Therefore, we're keeping all of the rules. And all the rules were kept.
And he kept telling people to
Right.
he kept referring them to the Dharma all the time.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and
Be their
I,
own life. Mhm.
so my I think we talk about how you treat a myth or how you deviate from a myth and what you want to show. I think in myths, sometimes you want to show aspects that maybe are very subtle in the myth or in themselves, but they get some underlying truth. And that's sort of, I
Yeah.
try to teach to see the process of Nibbana, the process of the Buddha as being dynamic and not static. And I think
Yeah.
the same thing happens with Jesus. When
Mhm.
I think you even create the scene of when the woman touches his cloak, and at first he reacts very negative to her.
That's actually in the gospel. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's in the gospel. But then he seems to change. You know, right then and there, he seems
He
to,
evolved. Yeah.
yeah, he looks back and he says, your faith has healed you. You know, something. So there is something dynamic about being awakened. That it's
Yeah.
not just, oh, I'm here and everything is the same.
And that both Jesus and Buddha, who we think of as fixed and permanent, or I don't know how people think of Buddha, but people can think of Jesus that way. But very much the Gospels show that he would revise his thinking. And the Buddha, obviously, in your book, that's part of the story. He had
It
to
is.
revise his thinking.
Right, and that actually in the suttas, he does. He at first forbids women, and then because Adanda persuades him, he accepts women. That appears in the Pali Canon. That's the
Yeah.
original
Which
oldest.
was a big deal that he really felt like, oh, come on, yeah, sure, they should be able to, but that, yeah, I don't know whether that's a point at which you want to read anything, or the other question I have is to just talk a little about your research about the times. But there's a wonderful scene on page 111 where he basically says, oh, come on, I can't do that. I don't know. It's your choice whether you want to read that, whether you want to start telling us about your research, which I'd like to hear more about.
Well, I could just read a little bit of that.
Yeah, it's a short scene.
This is after the book. Now Yasadara is left. The Buddha leaves his wife to his family. I mean, she's left with the Buddha's family, her father-in-law, mother, stepmother-in-law. He's the Buddha's stepmother, and he returns after he's enlightened after 6 years. So he comes back and he's around for a while before he makes an effort to see his wife, and she's wondering about that, and that figures it in the plot. I won't go into a lot of that, but they finally meet, and she's very impressed with him, and she's very impressed with the truth that he seems to emanate, both physically and some of his ideas. So she thinks, a sudden hope, the first I'd felt in a very long time, spiraled upward inside me. I now understood Rahula's urgency. Rahula, the son, has now become a monk. I want to join your order, I said, and devote my life to the Dharma. I smiled into his clear eyes. We can raise our son together. My former husband's shoulders dropped, and I had this strange feeling that his body, which the Tathagata now occupied, that was what he called himself now, the thus come, thus gone Tathagata. I had the feeling that his body, which the Tathagata now occupied, was reaching out of its own memory of the past. He spoke softly. Yasi, that's impossible. What do you mean? I can get permission. He shook his head. Women can't join the order. A new darkness fell over me, as if someone had slammed shut every door and window in the room. Can't join? But all I've heard is that your Dharma is for everyone, that any member of any Varna is welcome to ordain, and yet women can't? I'm sorry. You're sorry? You betrayed me. You went off on the journey that you stole from me and left me to a life of triviality. I waited for you, brought up our son, endured the arrogance of your male relatives, and now I can't even reap the benefits of what you gained, except as some crumb tossed out every couple of years that you happen to be in the area. You've not only betrayed me, you betrayed who you once were, someone who kept his promises. His voice remained soft. It's true, he said. Siddhartha would have allowed it, but now I am one with the Dharma. With the eyes of Dharma, I see that our society will never accept my teaching if women are allowed to live with men in such a way. We're attempting something that's never been done before, gathering a Sangha, a community that will awaken on its own without priests or sacrifices, but by its adherents banishing their own ignorance. The priests and the Brahmin will try to stop us in every way possible. The presence of women would give them a weapon to discredit us. I had the momentary thought that he was not any Tathagata or my former husband, but Mara the evil one, delighting in his clever excuses to exclude women, and me in particular, from the truth. I don't believe you, I said. You're not omniscient. You may have the eyes of Dharma, but they're in a human body. You've chosen to risk admitting pig farmers and vulture catchers, but women are to remain trapped in suffering because you see them as a weapon. Through the windows, the sun had risen, backlighting him and concealing him in shadow. I stared at the spot where his face should have been. You have nothing to teach me, I said, and I won't let you take my child. The blankness spoke. You need to let him choose, Yasi. Your brother will train him as a warrior. Is that what you want? And I'm his father. You're not his father, I said. I turned to leave. You are the Tathagata, the thus gone.
Whoa, that is a great passage. So this might be a good time. I think we've got maybe 10 more minutes or so of our talk, but I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about your research and about the times that they lived in, the place of women, what that society was like, and just give us, say a few words about Stick Woman, one of my favorite characters. People need to know about her. I know we can't go into it in great depth, but man, just buy the book for Stick Woman alone. So give us a portrait of that time, if you can.
Well, it was the end. We're talking, the Buddha supposedly died in, well, the traditional date of his death is 483 BCE. Now they're saying the average time that everyone has come upon is 404 BC. So the 5th century BC. It's a fascinating time in India because it's a part of what they call an axial era, where everything is up for grabs and people are asking questions. People are suffering a lot more from these existential questions. And the society itself was doing fairly well. There was agricultural surplus, so there was trade, there was travel, there was exchanges of cultural viewpoints, so people could no longer depend on their safe little worlds with their certain little gods, because they're hearing about other gods in other worlds. And I think that's one of the things about an axial era, which is, they say it went from 800 to 200 BC. It's when this sort of turning and existential angst occurred. It occurred in Israel in the prophets saying, God, why aren't you helping me anymore? You have that, and you have it with the Greeks questioning everything. So it was kind of across the board. The Chinese were also doing this, and it seems to have happened with the rising of cities and these cross-cultural exchanges. No one knows for sure what caused it, but it seemed, a lot of people said, this is a real evolution in human consciousness. This is a kind of self-consciousness that didn't appear until now. And what exactly that self-consciousness is, I could go on for a long time, and I won't, about the various theories of it. But anyway, the Buddha was born into a time when becoming a holy man or holy woman was considered quite respectable and considered, a heroic choice in some ways. But in the myth, and obviously the householder and the rich landowner, they don't want their kids to go out and do it. They just want, But it was something that being done, and people were raising all kinds of questions. The religion of Brahmanism, which, by the way, considered Sanskrit and the Vedas, they existed whether human beings did or not. They were like the Platonic forms. They were the truth. And so the viewpoint of Brahmanism and a lot of the other kinds of viewpoints at the time was that we are living in a sort of a degenerate age, and there was a golden age back before people started having all these questions, right? Or asking all these, being so insecure. There was this golden age, and we just have to remember what we can, and things are degenerating. So there was no concept of social improvement or that idea of social moral progress. And it wasn't, and slavery was taken for granted. I mean, neither the Buddha or Jesus was an abolitionist. That was just part of the, you'll get your reward in heaven, you become enlightened, but they were not questioned that way. And so it was, in that way, it was different from these times. But in this radical questioning, it was very similar to the times that we live in now. You have people that believe in nothing. I mean, these nihilists would go around saying there's no cause and effect. It's all fake news. You have that viewpoint, and then you have people that we're all united in the great oversoul. It's all one, and it's fair. All you have to do is obey these ritualistic rules. It wasn't even a matter of ethics. I mean, in these earlier forms, there wasn't a distinction made between ethics and ritual, and the Buddha was the person who introduced the concept of intentionality. Something was good or bad ethically because you depending on your intention.
He also welcomed people from, I think, even though they might not have framed it the way we would, both Jesus and the Buddha welcomed people that were considered to be lower orders or outcasts.
Yes, yes, they were. And he did have his contingency. I mean, his contingent was probably upper, fairly affluent, a lot of the people. I mean, they were the sons of the gentleman farmers and that type. Gentleman farmers. He hung out with kings.
Yes, he did.
But everyone was admitted to the Sangha. But if a slave disobeyed his or her master, they were not admitted to the Sangha.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, that doesn't come out in the book, but that's interesting.
This is something. Who knows whether that was added or not? I mean, one of the problems I ran into is there are inconsistencies in this.
Yeah, sure.
Dharma, the way the Dharma is described, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, all the fetters, and what's sometimes called numerical Buddhism, a lot of that is amazingly consistent. And even when it isn't, it's completely consistent. It is consistent in terms of what it's really instructing you to do. And it's gender free. But, a lot of these little stories and sayings, some of them are kind of nasty, especially the ones that are about women. There are a few really misogynistic things. Some of the words are put into the Buddhist mouth. I happen to believe that this was politics. After the Buddha died, people decided on what they were going to say, and people made compromises because they're simply not consistent with the Buddha's attitudes. Because the Buddha always, even before he admitted women to the Sangha, he always said that women could become enlightened.
Well, tell us just a little bit about Stick Woman, who creates a turning point for Yasi. She's like, and there were hill people that were sometimes persecuted by these clan leaders. She was a real turning point. So let's not leave Stick Woman out. Give her a little cameo appearance.
Stick Woman is fictional, and the hill people, the hill tribes do and did exist. And this tribe is based very loosely on the Khond people, Khond, who actually exist to this day, and were much more traditional and shamanistic, and had a goddess figured in largely. I don't think it was a matriarchal, egalitarian matriarchy or anything, but Stick Woman was independent of them also, though. She comes from a tradition of non-teaching Buddhas, who supposedly walked the earth when there was no Buddha around to teach them. And I stretched that a little bit because there was a Buddha around at that point. But I sort of saw her as, possibly one of these people that had come to enlightenment on her own. And this was allowed as a possibility in the tradition. So, and then, but I needed that sensibility. I needed that shamanistic nature love, not, the idea of seeing the points of view of plants and animals and being alive to nature, whatever that means, and however that will tempt Yasi, because that turns out not to be the following that she was the life she's going to follow, but she had to really immerse herself into a different sensibility and spirituality before she could go back and face her husband.
And it helped her up through her life.
Yeah.
That being able to see
and
that way.
stayed with
And,
her.
and she, you know, she had good old like fetch wood, carry water type ordeals that she had to go through, and she learned about plants. And anyway, you got to read that. You got to read the book, everybody.
I have to say, she is someone that, you know, came to me, and she would come to me in the book, and I think, oh God, sick woman's here. And why sick woman? Oh, I had to call her sick woman.
And don't think you're done carrying water.
Right.
And don't think you're done forgetting. Yeah, I loved her voice. She had a great voice.
Yeah, but that was it. But that's the most fictional part of the book. But it's also based on what I call like some inner truth of mine anyway.
Yeah.
Whether or not it.
Yeah, it tells you that Barbara McHugh is a great novelist.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I do. I know. Yeah.
Well, I take that as very much as a compliment, because as you know, I am a huge fan of yours. And we can't spend time stroking each other here, but I have to say that.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Is there more that you want? Is there something that you want to say before it opens up to questions? Something concluding thing that you want to say?
What do I have to say?
Some wisdom.
Beginner's mind. Let's all look at. You know, I guess the one thing that, well, no, I'll let it go. Let's just keep beginner's mind here, and feel free to ask questions, and or not, and just open it up to questions.
Great.
Are there any? If not, I can always do another reading, and we can go on.
Yes, you can. If there aren't, you can do another reading.
Do we have the hand? How's it?
I don't. Oh, here's one. It looks like, yep.
I don't know if we're allowed to. Oh, I wanted to know if you would tell us about other books you've written, or the book you're working on now, or is that not something that you can talk about at this venue?
Are you asking me or Elizabeth?
You.
Oh, you.
Well, I'm working on a book right now about takes place 3,000 years in the future, a woman's society that goes wrong. And because of the same problems that occur in this book, one of the Buddhist terms for when your mind kind of goes crazy and creates conspiracy theories and blaming people, it's called in Buddhism papancha mind, proliferating mind. And it's suddenly when you've always meant this, you're trying to undermine me, and you and your friends too, you know, and suddenly your mind is proliferating all these ideas. And that happens in my book, the book that I'm working on now. But that's all I'll say about it. There's one other book, all right, since we have a silence place here. I've also writing a book about a multiple personality. And that's
And there's Elaine.
Hi, I was just wondering, when you were researching about Buddha's wife, was there a lot of information on her? And I know you don't want to give away the end of your book, but did she actually gain enough enlightenment to get over the anger of him, leaving her?
That's a really good question. In fact, there's very little about her in the original Pali Canon, which is where I got a lot of my stories. I mean, it ends with her saying to her son, who is now 7 years old and wants to be a monk. And he doesn't want to be a monk yet, but she sort of takes him to the Buddha and sort of says, go Rahula, this is your father, get your inheritance. We don't hear from her again in the Pali Canon. After in the tradition, there are lots of rumors and legends and stuff about her, that she became enlightened, she joined the Sangha. There's one myth that she actually was pregnant for the entire 6 years that the Buddha, you know that a woman didn't write that one. The time
Yes.
the Buddha was seeking enlightenment, his wife was pregnant. So there are all these kind of crazy stories about her. There are also wonderful teachings by the Buddhist nuns as part of the Pali Canon. So the fact that the Buddhist women became enlightened back then is canonical. A lot of the stories I use about Ananda are from that scripture. And the stories about Ananda was really what impelled me to make that sort of gender switch thing, because there is a case for Ananda and Yasodhara being the same person. I mean, I'm not saying I'm a scholar, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just saying it's interesting that, first of all, Ananda was not enlightened the entire time the Buddha was alive. He did not become enlightened until after the Buddha's death, which is strange because everyone around the Buddha was enlightened. I mean, as close as
They said they were.
They said they were. There was even, and in the, they were shown as in the suttas as he awakened on the spot, that type of thing. And he even had like a former mass murderer was in the Sangha, and he was enlightened. So why wasn't Ananda enlightened? And one reason would be, well, perhaps because of the life of deception that he was leading, because he was concealing the gender. We don't, and also there was a whole issue for her of forgiveness, not of only of the Buddha, but of the people. You have to read the book to see what the sins against her. But this idea that, if the Buddha's wife were Ananda, that would be a life of deception, perhaps could not achieve enlightenment until she came to terms with that. Then the other thing that I think is even more powerful is that here's this unenlightened monk who persuades the Buddha to knit women. And the Buddha knew all the arguments. Why would he allow this woman, and I'm not going to say it's in the book why he allows the woman, why would he allow this unenlightened monk, to persuade the Buddha? And I thought, well, that's very interesting. And then throughout his life, Ananda really he did further women's causes. He was a defender of women in most of the stories. So I thought, yeah, this makes sense. So it wasn't that I just was pulling something out of nowhere. The stories of Ananda are very compelling to me.
So you're saying Ananda could have been his wife? Maybe.
Right. I said that I was actually talking to a Buddhist scholar once, before the book came out, and she was like faintly appalled that I would even think this. She said, but it's not in scripture. I said, no, but I'm writing a novel. It's fiction, a story. Well, I didn't make it clear. I'm not stating this. I'm not saying that I'm writing a new scripture. It is a novel.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Barbara, I have a question about, in your preface, you were talking about a lot of what's come down to us about the Buddha as a form of myth, and that, that he was this great prince and everything. Now, were you saying the fact that he had this wife was also part of this myth? Or is this something we can take to be true, that he had a wife and a son?
As far as I've read, all of these things about the Buddha are legendary. We don't know.
I see.
We really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We know there's a very, very pretty airtight case that he was not a prince for various reasons, and there's a lot of evidence that he was not a prince.
So his son is in the scripture, Rahula?
Yes, his son. Oh, yeah, his son, very dumb. And his son also, a lot of the things I write about Rahula are there's evidence in scripture. But again, we don't know even if he had a son. In fact, right now there's somebody trying to prove there was no Buddha.
Oh,
Okay.
I see. Yeah.
So, but it's a lot is not known about the Buddhist ministry. A lot is told about his enlightenment, how his beginning of his ministry and then at the end of his life, but about 20 years is practically nothing is known about it. So again, we're talking about a time when writing was not done. I think there was writing existed, but very few people did it. And the oral tradition passed along these stories, and that was all we had.
I see. So, okay, so there is in scripture, there's plenty of references to the wife and the son, but we don't know whether it's, factual based on truth or part of the legend and the mythology of the Buddha.
Right. There's enough for me to think, yes, he had a wife and son.
Okay.
But,
Okay.
I may be wrong. I don't know. We're talking, or there was enough that the story was passed along, and that simple story of going forth from his family is fairly solid in the scripture.
Okay. Okay. You feel that that's fairly solid. Okay. That was the only question that I had.
I'm not. Anyone else?
What is that background behind you? Is that
banyan tree?
But is it a painting, or are you really outside, or?
I'm glad it's that. No, it's a photograph. I just
wow.
put it partly because banyan trees do figure into the novel to some extent.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that
So,
major.
So,
It's a painting of a banyan tree behind you.
well, actually, it's a photo.
A photo. Beautiful tree. Well, did you take that picture when you were in India on one of your trips? No.
Oh, I wish I had. I didn't. The first time I was in India, I didn't even, when I was there for 4 months on my own, I didn't even have a camera. But we have some pictures. Unfortunately, we did not take this one.
Yeah. Oh, it's a fabulous. That's not the Bodhi tree, though, is it?
No, it isn't. It's
okay.
Bodhi tree is, I think, a kind of ficus.
Barbara, I want to say thank you for all your years of study and research and good humor and inquiring mind and intentionally good heart and putting this together and bringing it to us. I'm awaiting desperately. Your book is it's on its way to me. And Miss Cunningham, I have fallen in love with you and I'm ordering you ASAP. And I just want to thank you for bringing this into my life and everybody else's life. I've been spreading the word, but it's been a blessing. It's
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank Barbara.
Thank you. Definitely.
Beginning of some beautiful friendships.
Definitely. I think Barbara knows I love her.
Yeah.
Sisterly love.
I have a question.
Are you on?
I think I am.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. I'm wondering when you were over in India, if you made any side trips to Sri Lanka. When I was a child, I had the opportunity to live in the Buddhist South, and there's such a rich Buddhist tradition there, and there are so many carvings, and I'm wondering, is their practice a little bit different? And just whether or not you have any anything to say about that.
Their practice is somewhat different. I'm not, I don't know that much about it. I haven't been to Sri Lanka. I've sort of entertained the idea of, because of, my husband brought it up, of writing a novel about King Ashoka's daughter, who supposedly was the person who brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never been there, and I don't know that much about their practice. I know that they've had a lot of stuff with, the Protestant missionaries and kind of the the faith has shifted a bunch of times, and so I'm not sure what's going on with it. But you're probably a much better expert at it than I am.
Oh, no, I was just a little kid, and I was pretty enthralled with the little shrines on the edge of rice paddies way out in the middle of nowhere, and incense, and the Festival of Lights, and all the interesting things that were going on. And it did capture me, and it stayed with me, even though I'm not a Buddhist practitioner or anything. I'm still very interested, and yeah, it just left me feeling that there was more than just Methodism, which is how I was brought up. So,
well, one thing I do know is that the Pali Canon was actually written down in Sri Lanka, so that was, I think, in the 1st century BC. It was like it is a very important seat of Buddhism there, and so yeah, it's something that I've sort of been working with in the Buddhist time, and I haven't gotten beyond it enough. But yes, it certainly the written tradition begins there.
yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Barbara,
Yeah, it is.
I would be interested in having women meditation teachers who are current know and read about your book. And I'm wondering, are you doing any kind of promotional effort with sanghas or centers around the country for this?
Some, yeah. I'm trying to think of, it's one of the people that, let's think, but not a whole lot at this point.
If they were able to read the novel and use it in their teachings in the Sangha, would it be, how would you see its impact in terms of affecting practitioners?
I mean, I almost sort of see it as not as a formal teaching tool or anything. I think but I think that as I said earlier, understanding this tension between love and transcendence, or sometimes it's between the ascetic tradition and the service tradition, in really sharpening, that conflict. And that's sort of one of the things I wanted to pull out of the book, and just portraying that. And then some of this little dharmic, I have like, yes, she does meditate, she has different experiences, and that comes from the best of my knowledge of my experience meditating. So, but it's really more of something to read for, sort of sharpening your consciousness, and can help practice, hopefully. At the very least, you can argue against it, and that can be, that in itself is a practice.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I could do one other reading.
Yeah, I think you should end with a reading. Yeah.
Okay. Oh no. All right. This happened. This is actually what spurs Yasodhara. Sometimes people pronounce it, and Yashodhara, but I've never been able to pronounce it that way. And the bottom line is we don't really know how these languages were pronounced.
You can call her Yasi for short.
Yeah, I call it, and also, I mean, I read people will read it as Yasodhara, so there you go. Anyway, when she is 10 years old, her younger sister dies accidentally. She blames herself. And she tells herself, Yasi tells herself that Deepa, the sister, can't really be dead. And she decides that she's going to try to rescue Deepa in the charnel ground where she's been left. So this scene is when she visits the charnel ground. And obviously she needs to do this without her family knowing. The night after Deepa's funeral, the moon, 3 days past full, rose late, but well before midnight. I slept in the same room as my 3 older sisters, and now I had to wait for their steady breathing and their little snores before I could start my journey. As I crept down the wooden stairs to the side entrance, the air was sour and weighed down with stale incense from the previous day. And I kept thinking of my mother's description of the charnel ground after dark, foul and slithering with ghosts mourning their lost flesh and driving living beings mad with fright. But when I opened the door to outside, the fresh night atmosphere braced my spirit and pushed away my fears. To the east of our family compound, the lopsided moon was big and yellow. Although its light was still weak, it sufficed, so I wouldn't need to steal the lamp. All I took with me was one of my own saris to wrap Deepa in so she wouldn't have to return home naked. I wore my dark blue day shift, which would be easier to run in if necessary. The windless night, cool in contrast to the dead air inside our house, seemed to heat up as I made my way to the packed dirt road that went around our village, a cluster of 12 2- and 3-story wooden buildings and 30 straw and wattle huts. A few scattered lamps glimmered faltering yellow light. The entire village looked to be asleep. Not that I walked in silence. Frogs and crickets clamored and dogs barked, echoing through fields of freshly sown millet, mist gray in the light of the rising moon. I was glad for the creature's noise. It would mask any sounds I might make. As I walked along the empty road, my fear, which I tried to ignore, began to swell up, tightening my chest and making it hard to place one foot in front of the other. I reminded myself I'd never seen a ghost, unlike almost everyone I knew, so I wasn't afraid of them. After all, those roving spirits never did anything. Still, anxiety sped up my mind, spinning off new problems. I had to face the possibility that Deepa really was dead, or that she died when they brought her to this terrible place. If so, I would have to beg her spirit to return to her body. I'd try to reason with it. What good was a spirit without a body? And if her soul was hurrying off to another life, did it really think it could find one better than Deepa's? We had a wealthy father, a loving mother, beautiful sisters, a house full of servants, and a brave older brother dedicated to protecting us. Deepa's spirit could end up inside a dog, especially considering that recently we made fun of one of those wandering ascetics who imitated dogs as a way to purify his soul. What if our heedless play created bad karma, which forced Deepa into the animal realm? By the time I approached my destination, the moon was shining in my face, making it impossible at first to make out the bodies and bones, except for dark patches and faint white shapes. The voices of the little night creatures echoed ominously in the stillness, but at least the vultures were gone. I increased my pace, as if I could leave my trepidation behind. Then I hit a wall of stench that knocked me to my knees. The other times, I'd seen the charnel ground from a distance, and it had been downwind. Tonight, there was no wind at all. I held my nose, but the smell leaked in, a combination of feces and decaying flesh. Yet worse, it had an ultimacy about it, as if it were the source of every foul odor in the world, warning me to run from it as fast and as far as possible. I staggered to my feet and forced myself forward. I had yet to arrive at the charnel ground proper. Deepa, I cried out, hoping she would come to me and we could both flee this wretched stench. But all I did was momentarily silence the crickets. I kept walking, gagging with every step, so preoccupied with the odor that I didn't realize I'd reached the grounds until I'd almost walked into a bloated corpse, its huge pale face inflated almost to bursting, its mouth a writhing ball of worms, black excrement for eyes. At this point, my body heaved and the smell of my own vomit knifed up through my viscera. It actually provided relief from the smell of death, but not from the horror pounding through my veins as I stumbled up the slope, the sickening crunch of rotting bones under my feet. Now on the charnel hill, I could see well enough, and it was horrible. I had to get Deepa out of here, but where was she? I dodged an armless skeleton and another naked corpse, this one face down, arms and legs flung out at impossible angles, as if the body had been tossed carelessly from above. Where were the spirits? By now I was in the center of the field, the moonlight turning the corpse a glistening gray and the bones chalk white. Deepa, I called out again and again. I screamed when I almost stepped on what once had been a baby, its head little more than a mashed piece of fruit, its mouth an empty hole in the center of her face. Reflexively, I looked up. Surely the spirit of such a little one would be still hovering above its body, unsure where to go. Then I realized there were no ghosts, no souls, only people who had turned into things. These things were far more awful than mere objects, more soulless than something that hadn't had a soul to begin with. They seemed to deny the very possibility of souls, not to mention life itself and the warmth and vibrancy of love. Far better to be haunted by armies of roving spirits, even demon spirits, than to have the image of these corpses settle in my heart. But now they had, forever. A shapeless new fear lurched up inside me, one I couldn't articulate at the time. It didn't want to in any case. Cold sweat sliming my body, I kept on. These things were not Deepa. Deepa was alive and trapped here, and only I could save her. I broke into a run, passing a heap of skulls, trying to make out her shape on the slanting moonlit ground. Deepa, I cried. Then, praise be to the Devas, I saw her familiar form, silver pale in the moonlight, up the slope just 2 or 3 body lengths away. The vultures hadn't touched her. Why would they? She was alive, lying much as she had on the plank behind our altar. I started toward her, but a sudden sound made me stop. My engrossment with the smell and the sight of the corpses, plus the bleat of the crickets, had prevented me from hearing the other sounds all around me. The sounds of feeding. Wild dogs, a good 30 of them, had spread out over the field singly and in groups, growling and gulping as they fought over the gray gore. I could see them clearly now, gaunt and ragged-eared, snarling and snapping with jagged rows of teeth, polished white by moonlight and their greedy saliva. One of them was headed toward Deepa. I broke into a run and reached her first, throwing my sari over her and snatching her up. She was heavy as stone and oddly stiff, from fear, I told myself, but I had no time to think about this. Staggering under her weight, I backed away from the dog, which seemed almost as tall as I was, only to have another one join it. They crouched down, one black, one a scruffy gray in the moonlight, as if about to leap, their growls growing louder. I was terrified to turn away, which would no doubt prompt them to launch themselves on top of us. Go away, I shouted in the most fearsome voice I could imagine and I could manage. Now 2 other dogs approached. I slung Deepa around, holding her collapsing form up in front of me, pain clenching my arms. Wake up, I screamed. We have to run, now. Her weight was getting unbearable, and she didn't move. I turned her stiff body to face me. Wake up! Then I saw her face, without expression, mouth half open. Her eyes were also partway open, cold, dull slits in the moonlight, as uncaring as gashes in stone. She was a thing. She couldn't be my sister. The first dog jumped, landing on the corpse's back. If I didn't let the dog have it, he and all the others would tear me to shreds. I dropped it and ran. I didn't stop running till I was halfway home. Then I fell and lay face down in the middle of the road, sobbing into the dirt. All I could think of was the hollow shell of Deepa's absence, now filled only by the horrible image of her as a thing. Then another image came to me, and the shapeless fear I'd first struggled against in the charnel ground finally took form. I too would someday be a thing. So would everyone I loved and everyone else, from the strongest warrior to the youngest baby. No, I shouted into the night, and the dogs erupted in barking. Reflexively, I filled with hatred. Then I stopped. They too were going to turn into things. Why hadn't I seen anyone's spirit? Had they left the corpses to go live elsewhere? But what could spirits possibly be without bodies to give them form? I struggled to my feet and started walking, not caring if the dog clamor I'd caused woke up villagers who would drag me home to be punished. No matter if my mother locked me up in some room. With this newfound knowledge of death, it didn't matter where I ended up. The dog racket died down, followed by the tiniest puppy yelp. I jolted to a stop, remembering the deepest spirit might be in a dog. Was it possible? That's what the wanderers were trying to find out. At that moment, the only worthwhile pursuit seemed to be this search for spirit. Under the white misshapen moon, I knelt down and promised my sister that I would find her soul so she would be with her family again and not have to travel through realms of samsara, lonely forever. As soon as I was old enough, I would go forth into homelessness and become a wanderer myself, uncovering the truth. It went without saying I'd never marry. I resumed walking. Back in the charnel grounds, the moonlit feast went on and on.
That guides her, all her choices. Yeah.
Sorry?
That guides that drives her life.
Yeah, that drives her. I mean, sort of that's the same. I mean, she sort of has the Buddhist experience at age 10. The one he had at age 29.
Oh.
So I guess if there are any final questions or summary statements, I should hold up the book, I guess.
Yes, hold up the book.
Hold up the book. This is the book. It's on sale at New Renaissance Books and online and other local bookstores. But New Renaissance. And I want to thank Claire for hosting and saying such nice things. And I thank Elizabeth. I can't thank you enough. It has been such a privilege to talk to you and knowing you and reading your books. And I can't wait to read all of them. And
Thank
I
you, Barbara.
your books to
and
everyone.
I'm glad you're writing another one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, New Renaissance.
And thank you,
Being an
everyone.
independent bookstore.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.